So I think oftentimes when we talk about Web3, there are some common themes that come up time and time and again. And one of the most common ones is identity. So what does that mean? Typically, when you use a Web2 SaaS service, your identity as a consumer of an API service or of any application really is dictated by the walled garden of that SaaS service. So you don't really have this notion of a portable identity that you take with you from API service to API service. So when we think about Web3 native video, what does it mean to have portable identity? When you're using a video application or when you're using Web3 video infrastructure, how should that experience look like to distinguish that experience from, say, a Web2 experience? So identity is one thing that we can consider. I think a couple other that are interesting to unpack a little bit is on the monetization and payment side. So how should video applications in this Web3 paradigm strategize in terms of monetization? So there are a lot of interesting techniques that are now available to you that weren't previously available, such as crowdfunding, such as NFTs, and you see a lot of interesting use cases for NFTs when it comes to monetization. On the flip side, you also have the application developers and how the application developers pay for their infrastructure. So how should application developers be paying for their infrastructure in this Web3 native video paradigm? I think there was a good comment in the last talk. I think someone brought up that they might be a member of a DAO, and the DAO has a treasury of all these tokens, and they were inquiring about using the tokens from that treasury in order to use Livepeer. So that's actually not something that you could natively do today, right, given the way that APIs are structured, and it's not clear how a DAO, which is formed around a set of smart contracts typically and is this amorphous group of people, it's not clear how a DAO could come together and pay for API service. So when you're thinking about Web3 native video, how would something like a DAO be able to natively pay for infrastructure to use, given that it's a little bit different from how you think about how entities pay for API services in a Web2 context? So that's another pillar that we can think about. And lastly, within the Web3 video space, we've also seen a lot of problems that are specific to the emergence of the use of different types of media in all these different applications. So take NFTs, for example. We have a variety of different NFT marketplaces that have now emerged and have grown in popularity in the past year or so. But with NFTs, we've seen a lot of issues with things like fraud as well, where you see people basically claiming NFTs on different and multiple platforms, taking the same image or taking the same multimedia asset from an existing platform. And on one hand, this is super easy to do, right? A lot of people say you're like a right click away from being able to do this to someone. And some people just describe this as this is just like a part of how things work right now. But of course, you start seeing some of these pain points for creators as well when they become more concerned about how their media assets are used across the internet without their permission or without their knowledge. So to summarize, I think some of these pillars that I just highlighted include identity, so how portable identity is and how that influences how you interact with, say, video API services in a Web3 context. We have how video applications can monetize in this new paradigm. We have how developers are able to pay for their infrastructure, whether it's an individual or, say, a group of individuals like a DAO. And we also have tackling this authenticity or fraud problem that isn't unique to Web3, but you definitely are seeing a lot of that these days with the rise of NFTs. So those are just some themes that I think might be useful to orient around in terms of breakout conversations, but definitely want this to also be participatory. So I think maybe with the next couple minutes or so, would love to hear from folks if they have anything in particular on their mind that stands out to them when they think about Web3 native video. And if there's a lot of interest in that, we can kind of switch up how the breakout groups are structured so that we can organize around those themes instead of the ones I just mentioned. So happy to take any thoughts from anyone in the crowd. Let's go over there. Right. So I guess that's more so a question as opposed to a theme, but maybe a theme emerges from that. I mean, I'll take a quick shot at trying to answer that question, and it kind of answer it indirectly. So this is something that I've thought about a little bit, which is, so I think the problem that you highlight is just in both the music and video industry, basically any content consumption-based industry, you have this problem where if you can get the pirated content elsewhere and it's trivial to do that, then that feels like a problem for creators, which I think is true. But what's interesting in Web3, especially in the past year or so, is I feel like we've started seeing more experimentation in monetization that's less directly tied to, say, the content itself and valuing the content as is, and instead around all the social relationships and context around the content. So I think NFTs are the canonical example of this, where one way to think about it is that at the end of the day, we're talking about digital content, which is just a set of bits. And if you're valuing the set of bits based on like the physical properties of those bits, the value of that is basically zero in most cases, because it's trivial to copy it into any other particular context. So one line of thought might be, well, maybe trying to guard that content is an uphill battle, and maybe a lot of the efforts in the latest efforts in the past decade or so in Web 2 around kind of getting access to content, maybe that's not the right approach, and maybe there's a different approach that we can take where maybe the content itself, it's not actually a problem that the content itself can be shared freely and you can pirate it, because people still value this other thing, which is the context around the actual asset itself. Once again, going back to NFTs, you see a lot of people, yes, it's the case that you can go to IPFS, take the IPFS hash and trivially copy it and share it around, but people still have this draw and there's this allure to being a part of something and being attached to like the social relationships that are represented by the NFT. So my personal interest is exploring that line of thinking a little more, where yes, we could explore ways to continue to try to fight against pirated content, but maybe alternative approach is just to accept it and focus more on this alternative way of monetization and just focus on the context around the asset as opposed to trying to guard the asset really tightly in itself. But that's my 2 cents. Shannon. Really good question. I can also take a crack at that, but that's also a great question that I think the breakout groups should get into as well. I'll share a little bit about my perspective, but I think this is also meant to, this breakout session is meant to kind of like get the ideas flowing amongst the community as well. But just some thoughts there include, well, something that I've talked to with a few other people is, of course, like having Livepeer being decentralized video infrastructure is super important. But I think sometimes what might not be as clear to people are what are the properties that you actually get in your application because the infrastructure is decentralized. And I would actually think that there's not enough focus on that, where it's good to talk about how decentralized the infrastructure is, but what guarantees do the users and application developers actually have? And I think some of the things that are interesting to think about there, just to take one, is ownership preservation. So I think the example that I talked about with someone at some point was we have like end-to-end encryption infrastructure now, and one of the selling points of end-to-end encryption infrastructure is that at every point along the way, you can guarantee the privacy of your users, and that's something that you can advertise as a part of your infrastructure, like privacy in, privacy out. So that's like a guarantee you can give to your users. What are some of the guarantees that decentralized video infrastructure could provide to their users or developers? I don't know if this is the right one, but if we think about ownership, maybe one of them is ownership preservation from start to beginning, because oftentimes in these video ecosystems, you start with some video, but that's not like the end thing that you want to publish, right? It might go through lots of edits, transformations, transcoding, subtitling, all these things, and there's a variety of people that play a role in making those transformations, whether it be orchestrators on the network or other collaborators that you have. Maybe one of the properties that the infrastructure can provide to you, it doesn't provide today, is ownership, preservation, and provenance end to end. So at each step of the way, you know which orchestrators contributed to the transformation of your video, which other entities in your DAO contributed to the creation of your video. And that's something that is established from the starting point where you start using the infrastructure all the way to when you're actually publishing this video as an NFT or using it as a live stream in whatever context. So yeah, rough thoughts there, but hopefully that helps start the conversation, and curious what other people think as well. I'll take Chris.
Your first point was around identity. I think that's a really valuable thing, like thinking about what are the minimum viable connections to make in a Web3 context, taking things like Livepeer that's been around for some time, something like ENS that is like Ethereum name system, and interested to know what people are thinking about in terms of like proving out the concept for creators to be able to invest in like ENS on-chain Web3 names and have those things associated with the live streams they publish. And this for me comes into a whole like extra topic, but it's related to identity, but around discovery. Like how are people going to find the content? How's it going to be labeled? How's it going to be searchable? How's it going to get requested? So I think that's for me an interesting kind of like twist to give on identity as well.
Right. So I feel like one thing that stood out there is so discovery slash curation, right? So if Livepeer is successful as the world's video infrastructure, that means that it becomes super easy to publish any video content online and process it in a whole variety of applications. What do we do about, and one of the problems with Web2 platforms is the opaque nature of how all the curation algorithms work. So that seems like a logical next thing to think about and very relevant to kind of building a Web3 video application. So I think that could be a good theme as well, so curation slash discovery. Eric? Yeah, I think I feel like that ties with one of the things that was mentioned before around right now, it's not clear how a DAO gets access to video API services, where you can kind of add a layer of indirection, right? Where you can say like the DAO pays someone and that person has an email account, generates an API key, and that person handles all of the API service coordination. But there's no truly native way for a DAO to be like, well, we want to be able to coordinate funds in order to support video streaming for our organization, and we want to be able to do that in a native way. Right now, you have to basically interact a lot more with the Web2 world. So I think it would be great to unpack that a little bit. I wonder if that fits into this identity category, simply because when we think about identities in a Web2 context, it's like, for API services, it's like an email, right? But obviously, like an email probably is not the right way to identify people that are using an API service in a Web3 context. We want to be able to have an identity system that can represent people, organizations, DAOs, etc. So I wonder if that can like fit into that, just in the interest of not having too many groups. Cool. So unless there's anything else that anyone wants to, oh, Dion.
Going to be a Web3 solution to a Web2 problem, or is this
That's a really good question. Once again, I feel like different people will have different views on this. I'll try to give my take to kind of jumpstart things, but my thought is that it's both over a long enough time horizon. Regarding like a Web3 solution to a Web2 problem, I think that's very real, as like the problem of platform risk is very real. And just to provide a real example that involves video, there was a news article that came out maybe a month or two ago, and it basically had to do with some changes in Vimeo's use policy. And Vimeo is actually like, it's a really popular video hosting platform, and the content creators at Patreon are heavy users of Vimeo because Patreon at the time did not support a video integration on their own. So they outsourced this to Vimeo. And at the very beginning, it was a great deal because it was really affordable and there was a lot of nice aspects around it. But more recently, Vimeo as a part of their business strategy changed how videos are paid for, and they started charging more. I think the specific detail was around how bandwidth usage was incorporated into how you pay for things. And what ended up happening was that, well, all these content creators are getting the costs passed off to them, when previously they had a much better situation, and it basically left them with no choice but to decide, oh, do I pay Vimeo these exorbitant costs, or do I just run the risk of having my video assets disappear forever? Because if they don't pay by a certain point, if they don't upgrade, then basically there's no guarantee that they'll retain control over their video assets. And what that resulted in was this situation where people wanted to move, but it was a huge technical pain to move as well, because a lot of people built their applications with the back-end architecture assuming that it was Vimeo. And if you wanted to change, it required a huge re-architecture, and like, that's a huge pain. So that's, I think, a very clear example of platform risk and some of the rules being able to change underneath you with very short notice, and it was really painful for developers. So I think a lot of the things that Livepeer represents from an infrastructure standpoint, I think could very well present a solution to that problem, which is a quote-unquote Web2 problem that is very real. So yeah, hopefully that helps. All right, so for breakout groups, I think just to summarize, we had one around identity, we had one around curation and discovery, and I think we had one around how video apps would monetize in this Web3 paradigm, and then the last one, I believe, was how application developers could pay for infrastructure in a Web3 context. So if people are cool with that, then I would recommend splitting out into those 4 discussion groups. And I think the way that we can organize this is nice that we have tables. So I think we'll have one group here, and then in the back corners as well. So I think what we'll do is maybe this group can do identity. This group over here can do curation and discovery. And then the back corner over there will do how video applications monetize in a Web3 paradigm. And the back group over there will do how application developers would pay for infrastructure in this Web3 paradigm. So I would just recommend people self-select into the group that they find most interesting. And I think people should also feel free to move around. I think we'll have maybe like 25, 30 minutes. So hope everyone can have a good conversation.